So I'm just going to be moderating on behalf of Dr. Weatherald's presentation today. So we're just going to start with the land acknowledgement that we acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Thank you to Paladin for their support of the ATI seminar series. We're excited to invite you to register and submit abstracts for the 2 upcoming events, including the International Symposium on Systems Immunology and Transplantation, Advances, Challenges, and Opportunities, which is co-hosted by the ATI and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and is taking place in Edmonton, as well as ATI Research Day 2025, and the registration link for that will be in the chat. So Dr. Weatherald is an associate professor, pulmonologist, and clinician investigator in the Department of Medicine at the University of Alberta, where he works in the lung transplant and pulmonary hypertension programs. He's completed his undergraduate education at McGill University, followed by an MD and internal medicine residency training at the University of Alberta. He completed his pulmonary medicine fellowships at the University of Calgary, followed by a European Respiratory Society / Canadian Thoracic Society long-term research fellowship in Paris, France, and a Master's of Science in the clinical trials from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He moved from Calgary to the University of Alberta in 2022. His research program predominantly focuses on patient-oriented research related to pulmonary vascular diseases and right heart failure, with funding from CIHR, Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, Alberta Lung, and the CDTRP, and the Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium.
Well, thank you everyone for attending today. I'm Jason Weatherald. I'm based here in Edmonton. Laura just introduced the topic of my talk. I did want to point out some disclosures, specifically that the work I'm going to be talking about today was funded by the CDTRP, ATI and Paladin Research Innovation Grant, as well as an Alberta Lung Grant and Aid. And then I have some other disclosures that are unrelated to the topic of this presentation. So my objectives today are to go over the importance and the potential impact of stakeholder engagement when we're setting research priorities for any health condition, and then to introduce you to the James Lind Alliance methodology for research prioritization, and then go through the results of a recently completed national lung transplantation research priority setting partnership project. So just to make sure we're all speaking the same language, over a decade ago, Canada launched the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research. And there are different types of research, from the basic biomedical to the clinical, and then the implementation and health systems research. And translating evidence from one step to the next was identified as major gaps. And when we're talking about any research that involves human participants, this is the realm of patient-oriented research. So this includes clinical science, clinical trials, health systems research. And the definition used by the CIHR at that time was that patient-oriented research connotates a higher level of engagement of the patient in clinical research and the knowledge translation process. Indeed, there is growing support for the view that health research needs to assess interventions and outcomes considered important by patients and clinicians, and that by doing so, costly mismatches of research to needs can be avoided. Basically, you can summarize that from the patient's perspective as no research about us without us. So does anyone know who this guy is? I realized I asked you to mute your microphones, so you don't have to unmute them, but this is James Lind. So he is an interesting character. He was a Scottish naval surgeon who conducted what we consider the first controlled clinical trial. And this is also interestingly embedded in just a couple of pages, just 4 pages in his 450-page book that he published in 1753 called A Treatise of the Scurvy. But essentially, in the first controlled clinical study, he looked at 6 different treatments for scurvy, and scurvy is a condition related to vitamin C deficiency. And he gave them to sailors suffering from scurvy over 14 days, and there were 2 men in each of these arms. Now, importantly, in his treatise, There was no randomization, or the randomization procedures were not really well described. But I'll show you the quote from this book is that the sudden and most visible good effects were perceived from the use of oranges and lemons. One of those who had taken them, being at the end of 6 days, was fit for duty. The other was the best recovered of any in his condition, and being now deemed pretty well, was appointed to nurse the rest of the sick. So James Lind, credited as running the first clinical trial, is the namesake of this organization called the James Lind Alliance. And this was established in 2004 by Sir Ian Chalmers, who is the co-founder of the Cochrane collaboration, as well as John Scatting and Nick Partridge. So this was an organization created because of what they noticed was a decline in execution of non-commercial clinical trials. And it was noted, as you can see in the graph here, that most of the commercial trials are focusing on things like drugs, vaccines, biologics, devices, and surgery. But there are a lot of other interventions that weren't clinical study, and these were not being prioritized. And if you look at the bar in the bottom, the patient and clinician priorities were the majority of which were not drugs, vaccines, biologics, surgeries, interventions. They were other interventional strategies that were considered their priorities. So they noted that there really is this mismatch between the priorities of industry and academia versus patients, clinicians, and other researchers. So they established this initiative to open up discussion between patients and clinicians to agree upon priorities for future research on the effects of treatments. So they've developed a methodology and a system of setting these priorities that they call priority setting partnerships, or what I'll refer to as PSPs. And these enable clinicians, patients, their caregivers to work together to identify and prioritize evidence uncertainties in a particular health condition that could be answered by future research. And the outputs of these initiatives are a top 10 list of jointly agreed upon uncertainties that should be prioritized and presented to the researchers themselves, to industry, and to funders. This slide here just shows the overall process and the process that we used generally in ours. So at the beginning, you really need to figure out who your stakeholders are for this. So who are the patients, who are the clinicians, and you need to develop a protocol. And the James Lind Alliance has template protocols that help you follow this methodology. And then once you have the people and stakeholders in place, the next step is to figure out what are the potential uncertainties that could be answered by future research from the perspective of those stakeholders. And typically this involves some kind of a survey, design, and distribution. And then you need to look at this survey and sort of summarize things and figure out what are really people saying. So I'll get more into the methodology of how that's done, but you need to figure out which of these questions are relevant to what you're trying to prioritize and which of them have actually already been answered by existing literature. So a lot of patients may present excellent questions, but they may be questions for which we actually have compelling evidence that justifies an answer. Once you have a body of unanswered questions or uncertainties, then you need to generally shorten that list of questions to something that's manageable for prioritization. And that short list is then discussed in a workshop, which until more recently were generally done in person, but are often now done virtual. And patients from different walks of life, clinicians with interest in this condition, and their even patient caregivers come together with a specific methodology to come to a consensus top 10 list of future research priorities. And so this is one way of getting to that final answer of what are the priorities for future research. What has always drawn me to this process are the principles that underlie it. So it's about putting the patient voice and priorities on equal ground with the clinicians. And so they really have ideally equal involvement in the process. And it should be as inclusive as possible. But perhaps most important is it has to be as transparent as possible. So that means there's open publication and a transparent display of all of the initial responses that you get from every patient that answers the survey and how every question flows through the process to the final research priorities. So how many people contributed to each research priority, and what are the initial survey questions that justify those research priorities? This hopefully will become more clear with subsequent slides. The final principle is the commitment to using and contributing to the existing evidence base. So why did why did we think about doing this for lung transplant? So I previously had done one of these priority setting partnerships with in my main area of research, which is pulmonary hypertension, and this was CIHR funded, and it established a really close connection and partnership that I continued to have with the patient advocacy organization, the Pulmonary Hypertension Association of Canada. And we went through the process. We identified a top 10 list of research priorities, and a few of them are here from the top 10. And I wanted to illustrate how these can actually have an impact not only on one's own research career, but on the community at large. So of these three from the top 10, I was struck by these two top 10 priorities. So what are the mechanisms of right heart adaptation to pulmonary hypertension and right heart failure? And which interventions or treatment strategies result in the best outcomes for patients with pulmonary hypertension? So we use these research priorities to come up with new research projects. And so these new projects are really aligned with the patient research priorities. So in this instance, it was able to inspire us and sort of identify a major gap that we needed to identify. And we've developed a concept for a new platform trial that will test therapeutics for right heart failure across the spectrum of patients with different types of pulmonary hypertension. And we're in the process of starting a pilot version of that trial to look at feasibility and look at some remote data collection, which hopefully will inform the design of a larger phase 2 adaptive platform trial to look at novel and repurposed therapies in this condition. So this is just to illustrate that these priority setting partnerships can really help catalyze new ideas and partnerships. And I will say that in this CRAVE platform trial, the patient partners have been embedded from start to finish, from its conceptualization into grant applications, and will play roles on the steering committees within the clinical trial. So research prioritization in transplantation is not new. This is a publication from the ATI recently that looked at more broadly Alberta's research priorities to advance organ donation and transplantation, which used a different methodology, but a lot of parallels in terms of clarifying what's in scope, identifying priorities, and then prioritizing them. And they had 5 different working groups here, which you may be familiar with, and many people on the call, I think, participated in, that range from a culture of donation and donation practices to optimizing graft use and quality, improving immunological health, and improving long-term wellness for transplant patients. And I think you'll see that a lot of the research priorities that we identified really do complement and build upon these priorities, although in our approach, really patient-driven. So the objectives of the lung transplant patient priority setting partnership were to identify knowledge gaps in the literature and prioritize these evidence and uncertainties relating to lung transplantation, specifically from the perspectives of the patients, their caregivers, and clinicians involved in lung transplant care. Our secondary objective is to hopefully impact the future research agenda by helping to ensure that future lung transplant research that is performed and funded in Canada aligns with these patient priorities. So the scope of our project was really the Canadian environment. So it was the Canadian surgical and non-surgical centers. We were focusing on adult lung transplantation, but it was broad enough that it included patients who were in the pre-transplant setting as well as lung transplant recipients. We did consider a pediatric lung transplant out of scope for our particular project, and questions or issues regarding organ donation advocacy and health policy were not considered for prioritization. So we established this steering group, and I just wanted to call out Dr. Margaret Michaels, who was the master's student that Dr. Halloran and I supervised, who really led this project, and she successfully defended her thesis. This was one of the main projects for her thesis, and she did really most of the work that I'm going to be presenting here. We had 2 patient and caregiver representatives on our steering committee, and then clinician representatives from the 4 lung transplant surgical sites in Canada and one of the non-surgical sites in Calgary, Dr. Harper, as well. So we had a broad range of clinicians, hopefully reflecting the Canadian landscape and perspectives for this project. So we designed a survey, first of all, and we wanted to keep it quite open and try to improve access to the survey as much as we could. It started out in the Edmonton and Calgary clinics and then sort of rolled out into the BC, Quebec, and Ontario sites. And the survey was distributed to participants using this RedCap platform, but they could access it online. We were giving out these paper postcards that had a link and a QR code to it. And patients who wanted to fill out the survey by phone or by mail were also permitted to do so. And really the main question in the survey was, what, in your opinion, is the most important question that should be answered by research on lung transplantation? And patients could, and clinicians could answer this survey and could provide more than one response if they wished. So this was distributed across the country, and we had 235 respondents. We had quite a good breakdown between patients, health professionals, friends, family, and administrators. So almost half of the respondents were patients, a good contingent of healthcare professionals, as well as some caregivers. So in summary, these patients submitted 449 unique ideas or unique questions. Our breakdown, you can see here, was a little bit skewed, and part of this had to do with the way of rolling out a multi-center study like this, where it started in the coordinating center, which was in Edmonton, and so we had more time for participants to access this. So you can see that almost 50% of the respondents were from Alberta, but we did have respondents from across the country, the majority of whom were female, but there was a pretty good sex breakdown, as you can see on the graph there. So of these 449 questions, we tried to just categorize them to get a sense of how they were related to each other and what sort of topics they related to. And so this is just a broad pie graph, but you can see that I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So a lot of the questions came from patients and had to do with education or access to education, whereas one of the other more common topics was support and rehabilitation. So going back to one of those earlier slides, you can see that some of the things that are on our patients' mind don't necessarily have to do with medications or complications or new interventions or treatments. They actually have to do with knowledge and support and getting better after transplant with things like rehabilitation and physiotherapy. And some of the things that maybe from a scientific perspective, us clinicians and researchers might find more cutting edge, like novel therapies or bioengineering grafts, these were actually not as frequently proposed by the respondents of the survey. So how did we take these initial responses and put them into action? It's actually more complicated than it sounds, and definitely more subjective at times. So first of all, we tried to remove responses that really didn't, we didn't think we would be able to move forward, in the sense that they were too vague, they were perhaps not pertinent or out of scope, or they just contained personal anecdotes that were not really able to formulate into a researchable question. And some examples are here, just one-word answers that were really open to a broad interpretation, like costs, or questions that very clearly had a specific medical answer to, like, is there any other blood thinner that could be used other than warfarin? We know for sure there are alternatives to that. And then really patient specific symptoms that were related to a specific patient that couldn't really be focused into a researchable question. So once we categorized all of these 400 and some responses, we tried to combine them into similar researchable questions, which are not the same as research questions. They're not focused. They're not something to which you could develop a hypothesis, but they're more like a research topic. And admittedly, these are somewhat subjective. They require some interpretation on the part of the investigators. And we did have some iterative consultation between Margaret and myself, who were trying to formulate these questions, and our patient and caregiver partners, to make sure that the questions that we were trying to develop were true to the spirit of what the respondent wanted to say. And sometimes that was still hard to interpret. But an additional problem was that sometimes your questions become too focused, and then there's multiple questions that are quite similar to each other. And sometimes they're too broad that you couldn't really conceptualize narrowing them down into a research. But we did try to, whenever possible, maintain the original phrasing that was proposed by those survey respondents. So that may be a bit, I guess, vague, but here are some examples of how we did this. So on the left in this table, you see some of the original responses from the survey and who they came from. And on the right column, you can see how we formulated these into a potentially researchable question. So the researchable question was, what are the possible short and long-term psychological and physical issues associated with post-transplant recovery? So these relate to some of the initial submissions from the patients, like what are the main psychosocial issues, or is someone looking at emotional, mental side of the nightmares endured when the patient is sedated? These are extremely real and vivid, and so you can see the patient gives their own context, but we tried to take these and interpret them and reformulate them into something that could be looked at from a research perspective. Oh, sorry. Here's another example just to hammer that point home. So, how can immunosuppressive medications be improved to minimize the degree of immunosuppression or pill burden in lung transplant recipients? And again, you can see some of the original responses from the survey here and who they came from. And also note that sometimes the way that they're formulated is quite different between clinicians who answered the survey versus the patients, who always really provide a more personal context to the question. So next, we were successful in taking these 449 submissions and creating 117 unique summary questions, like those what we call indicative questions that reflect the initial surveys. But then we had to figure out, which of these are likely to be important, which one of these are we going to take forward? And there's different ways of doing this the next few steps, but because of our time crunch, we wanted to shortlist these so that we were focusing our efforts on questions that we felt were most important to patients and caregivers. So we sent out another survey to the initial responses and just asked them to rank each of these questions in terms of how important they felt they should be considered in the top 30 questions. And with those top 30 questions, we tried to verify whether those questions had been answered with existing research. And so we took some leeway here as well. So the James Lind Alliance methodology defines an evidence uncertainty as a question for which no up-to-date, reliable systematic reviews of research addressing the uncertainty exist. Or those systematic reviews exist, but they show that there's uncertainty. Now, that's potentially problematic using in a rare condition like lung transplantation, where there maybe aren't as many systematic reviews and there probably aren't as many randomized controlled trials. So we tried to use a bit of a evidence hierarchy that was different. So we included guidelines and systematic reviews, but we also considered randomized controlled trials and prospective observational studies as potentially being sufficient levels of evidence to answer one of these questions. That is to say, this question is more or less certain or answered, and we were not going to bring it forward for future prioritization. We did exclude, however, retrospective observational studies, animal experimental studies, case reports, and editorials. So those were not considered sufficient evidence. And so this was actually probably the stage of the project that required the most work. So we essentially did a systematic review of all of these studies, and we identified 6,457 studies, and these were all screened by our team, and over 3,000 of them were actually reviewed for full text to see if they were eligible for inclusion. There's a variety of reasons why studies weren't eligible for our evidence check, but yeah, even if you've ever done a systematic review, you know how much work this is, and even having 940 studies that were sufficient quality or level of evidence for inclusion, you understand that that's a large amount of citations to handle and to go through. So what we did at this stage is we took our questions. We actually had a tie of the top 30, so we had 31 questions, and we tried to map the evidence using search functions in an Excel spreadsheet to try to find studies that did map to a question and then determined whether or not that question was sufficiently answered by the existing evidence. So once again, we said the question was answered if there was a definitive or likely conclusion based on at least one systematic review, randomized controlled trial, guideline recommendation, or prospective observational study. So I'll just give one example because this was a question that ranked fairly highly. It was, what is the impact of coronary artery disease, both revascularized and unrevascularized, on lung transplant outcomes? And it turned out that there was a systematic review actually published by the surgical group here at the University of Alberta fairly recently that we felt, based on the synthesis in that systematic review, indicated that this question was sufficiently answered. And we have specific quotes for each one of these from the citation showing how this hopefully answers the question along with the evidence level. So after doing that in the top 31 questions, we did remove 6 questions that we said were either partially or sufficiently answered by existing research. And we had then a top 25 list. So in the final stage, we bring this top 25 list to a final workshop. So we arranged a virtual workshop over 2 half days. This included patients and caregivers, as well as lung transplant physicians and nurses, as well as other staff. And then patients or the participants are split up into 3 groups that are separate, and each group has a facilitator that's trained specifically in this methodology of reaching consensus. But there's a bit of homework to do before the workshop, and participants had to read through all of the candidate questions in the top 25 list and identify their 3 most important and their 3 least important. So on day 1, the groups were mixed up and they were split into balanced groups with a clinician at least in each group, and they discussed their top 3 and bottom 3, and they deliberate on this. And what I will say is really interesting is the dynamic between the patients and the caregivers, as well as the clinicians, and how the discussion, which is certainly collaborative and not at all coercive, can help influence what people thought were their top questions. And what I mean by that is that some of these questions, as you'll see, have fairly specific terminologies in them, and a lot of patients don't necessarily understand beforehand the importance of certain conditions in lung transplant. For example, chronic lung allograft dysfunction, or CLAD. They may not really have fully understood what that meant, but in the discussion with other patients and caregivers, understanding the importance of this chronic lung allograft dysfunction, it did influence where patients would rank a question in their top 10. And then on the second half day, these groups were reorganized and they deliberated on a final list. And each group has a numeric order, and then those are all combined numerically to get an average score for each question, and then ranked in terms of their score, and that gives you your top 10 list. And so ultimately, we had this final list, and you don't need to read through all of them, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but I just wanted to point out a couple of them. Question number 3 was, how can chronic lung allograft dysfunction be prevented and treated? Question number 6 was, how can we prevent and treat baseline lung allograft dysfunction? And in number 10, and still important, is how can patient education and communication between transplant recipients and their healthcare providers be optimized? So there are really a variety of questions that showed up in our top 10 that had to do with acute graft rejection, progression of chronic lung allograft dysfunction, diagnosis, and mitigating the toxicities of our immunosuppressive regimens, as well as some more team-based or communication and education topics. So I think that ultimately at the end, everyone was happy with what was in the top 10 and how the process went to establish this top 10. Now, we sent out a survey to participants afterwards, and I just wanted to give some specific quotes from the patients and clinicians that participated. So this person said, I agree with the top 10 that we came to. As a pre-transplant patient, my personal top 10 differed in some ways from the healthcare professionals and post-transplant patients. Having their input helped me understand other topics, and my perspective was changed on other topics. Another person said, I enjoyed the process. It opened my eyes to concerns that I had not really thought about until I heard other people's thoughts. And another one here, the members of both groups I was involved with were well informed. They explained the medical terms and processes that were being discussed, and my individual prep allowed me to confidently make informed decisions. Very lastly, this person felt that it was a very effective way to come to our final conclusions. Being in 2 separate groups allowed us to hear others' opinions from both patients and healthcare professionals. So I think overall it was a successful project, and it gives us a bit of a roadmap that can influence some of our own research uh, agendas, as well as where to focus our efforts, and ideally would also result in some new research questions being posed by hopefully some of the people in the audience. Now, uh, certainly there are some limitations to this overall approach and to our PSP. So this is a survey-based um, project at its inception, and so there's implicit sampling bias here, and you are only really considering the opinions of the people you are able to reach. And we do know that, of course, there are specific groups that are patients that can be more difficult to reach and may have problems using technology to fill out surveys. We did try to break down those barriers as much as we could by giving alternative methods for completing the initial survey. And as I mentioned from the initial survey, there was probably unavoidably some regional overrepresentation from the Western centers, and certainly underrepresentation from the Eastern centers. Our questionnaire was available and distributed in French as well for people in Quebec. And then those were reverse translated into English for the subsequent stages. But we do have really more of a Western Canada predominant in our sampling. And as I mentioned, there is some subjectivity in trying to interpret these survey questions and putting them into a researchable question format. So, there are a variety of iterations that could have happened, and we may have resulted in different questions in the end. And lastly, I do always wonder that, how different would our results have been in the top 10 list of research priorities with just a completely different group of people from different walks of life. But I think when we go back to our top 10 list, most of the big problems that our patients face are reflected in that top 10 list. Acute lung allograft dysfunction, chronic lung allograft dysfunction, the toxicities and difficulties with immunosuppression. Those are really some of the main things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I do think maybe we would have had a different order, but I'm fairly confident that the most important questions made it into our top 10. Again, some final comments on this methodology and our PSP is that these really don't necessarily aim to identify and formulate novel research questions. So a lot of the questions that we've identified are already areas of active research. Really, that is not the purpose of these things. The real goal is to identify and prioritize these uncertainties to help researchers and funders ensure that their research is aligning with stakeholder priorities whenever possible. And if we do identify new questions, then great, that's a bonus. Importantly, though, because of the nature of the people we're engaging, these PSPs tend to favor more clinical topics and may, as you've seen, favor more things to do with education or care delivery rather than specific focused treatments or diagnostic tests. So some preclinical or mechanistic questions would certainly be overlooked with this approach. And so one conclusion is really that not being in the top 10 does not mean that a question is unimportant. It's just that from the perspective of the patients living with transplantation and their caregivers, these are the ones that were most important to them. And just to conclude, I wanted to thank everyone that was involved with this project. Again, just to highlight Dr. Margaret Michaels, who completed her master's and really did most of this work, as well as the team, Tamara Rader from the James Lind Alliance, who really helped us execute this and advised us on the methodology, and all of the other people who supported us. And I wanted to call out specifically the Alberta Transplant Institute, who was absolutely instrumental in getting this to the finish line with our final activities in our workshop, and to the funding agencies who provided the funding to get this done. And lastly, to all of the people, many on the call participated in this survey and process. The patients who gave their voice to this, we are indebted to you. And if you wanted to keep up with how this evolves and any publications that follow, this QR code will take you to the James Lind Alliance website, where the documents will eventually all be uploaded, and any publications can be found there on their website. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, people are thinking I'm just gonna ask a couple of my own. So one of the ones I was wondering about was how were patients and caregivers chosen to attend the virtual workshop? Was there like an invitation that was set out, or were particular people asked?
That's a great question. So at the end of the first and second survey, people were asked, do they want to participate in future stages of this project? Because from an ethics perspective, like collecting their contact information, we needed to have their permission to contact them afterwards. And because the initial survey was unidentified if they wanted it to be. So, by providing their contact information, we were able to re-engage those people afterwards and get some information about them and find out if they wanted to participate in the workshop. And then once we had a list of people who were interested, we tried to purposefully make sure it was balanced. Like we tried to make sure there were people, a fairly equal balance of men and women. We tried to get some geographic diversity. We really tried to get some ethnic or racial diversity as to the best that we could. These things are sort of hard in the end because ultimately we're dependent on who wanted to participate in the end. But those are some of the principles of the JLA is to try to make it equitable and to get everyone an opportunity to participate. So it was purposefully chosen with trying to maintain some of those diversity perspectives.
Thank you. Dr. Halloran?
Yeah, thanks. This is just more of a comment. I just really wanted to say congratulations to Jason and to Margaret. I saw firsthand what an absolutely enormous amount of work this is. And that it's just that it's a very interesting approach to consensus building. I hadn't really seen anything like this before your publication on the pulmonary hypertension, Jason. And so I think it's a really interesting approach to consensus building that spans a gamut of perspectives, and hopefully we see more of it in the future.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Yeah, it is it's increasing in its impact, I think. Like a lot of these are done in the UK, and if you go to the website, you can see all of the different disease areas that this has been done in, and some of them even recently have been published in really high impact journals. There was one for breathlessness that was just published in the Lancet Respiratory Medicine, so like the highest impact journal in pulmonary medicine. So I think increasingly these types of engagement projects are really looked at favorably, and are starting to have some impact. And as I said, I think personally it's had a big impact in sort of the direction that I've taken my research career. And just anecdotally, I kind of started the pulmonary hypertension one because I got back from my research training and I was a little bit lost as in terms of where I should focus my efforts after being in like a big institution that had tons of patients and a lot of different things going on. And so it really was a way to refocus what I wanted to do. And I sort of took the ideas and the priorities from the patients to sort of guide what I was focusing on next.
I had another question if, others are still kind of thinking about things. I was wondering whether or not with this methodology or just in general, there's any feedback that goes back for the questions that you recognize have been answered. If they're very popular, there's a lot of people wondering about it and they just maybe don't realize that the literature is there. Is there anything that kind of gets fed back so that people can see it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that really aligns with one of the other principles of this organization, which is transparency. So we're not quite done all of the evidence checking yet, but for all of those 117 questions that we formulated, Margaret and our team, we need to actually look at all the evidence for all of those questions and map them, and all of the documents that show that process will be uploaded to the James Lind Alliance website. So they're all there, they're all publicly available, and people can say, well, maybe my area of research isn't in the top 10, but here it is, and here are some of the other, evidence synthesis that have been mapped to it. So this is a gap in knowledge that I could focus on, even if it didn't make it into the patient caregiver top 10. It's still important. So that is all available on the James Lind Alliance website.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dr. Halloran.
I enjoyed this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Enjoyed this, and congratulations to all of you for this initiative. And I actually think as a researcher, when you look at where progress has been made in medicine, you can see that there was identification of a need coupled with recognition of an opportunity. And when you look at where progress has been made in cancer, in rheumatoid disease, in inflammatory bowel disease, etc. Much of the interventions have recently been made because the technology allowed you to identify a mechanism, and the intervention then targeted a mechanism in relationship to the questions of the unmet need. So I actually think that when you're pursuing this, you should think about trying to couple the questions which are arising from your survey to the opportunities in the platforms, and particularly being inspired by the examples in other areas of medicine where progress has been made in addressing these huge problems that people face, including, incidentally, healthcare delivery, not just molecular mechanisms, but opportunities in healthcare delivery. So I just raised a question. Do you think it would be worthwhile creating two new dimensions? One is a dimension in recognizing mechanisms that have helped in other areas of medicine, and second is recognizing opportunities for healthcare delivery interventions.
Yeah, that's a fantastic comment. Thank you. And I think, that really hit upon the first slide that I showed, which were these sort of these pillars of knowledge and the values of, or the valleys where sort of knowledge translation seems to falter between the mechanistic biomechanisms and then the clinical research and then the implementation research. And so I do think we need to think about how to bridge those gaps. And this is one way of doing it, or at least identifying the areas that we should focus on first. The second part of your question about the mechanisms, interestingly, in this process, there was only one question that really specifically talked about mechanisms of a disease, and that was what are the factors and mechanisms that lead to progression of CLAD. In our pulmonary hypertension one that we did, there were several questions actually that were more about the mechanism, because the patients involved there really understood in the workshop the importance of a problem, but sometimes you need, not sometimes, all the time, in order to solve a problem, if we don't understand the underlying mechanism, we're really shooting in the dark. And so we had a lot more questions about mechanism and translation in our other priority setting partnership. That didn't really come forward as much in this one. And I think that goes back to the inherent biases that are involved with the sampling, like just who are you getting answering these questions. Like, you kind of follow the methodology, but ultimately we follow the methodology so that we're minimizing our own biases in selecting which questions go forward. But I think overall that comment that you made is really important, and with our top 10, perhaps there's an opportunity to reverse engineer them and to look at these as identifying problems that are most important, and where mechanisms are not known, we need to identify that as an area for future research and bring it back to the bench, and then try to identify those as priorities for preclinical research as well.
Yeah, I think that the lessons from other areas of medicine could be brought into this. So the survey then can be the first stage in creating an understanding of where the priorities could be addressed. Where are the targets of opportunity?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the comment and the question. Appreciate it.
I think Kieran had another question or comment.
Sorry, yeah, I'll be quick. I know Michael has a question as well, but just to follow up on that, I think part of this relates to the fact that lung transplantation is fundamentally very distinct from an effort like pulmonary hypertension, where you're really dealing with a singular disease to some extent, a relatively singular pathophysiology, and you can really, tease out some mechanisms. I think it's just further along than us, and lung transplantation is a very, very heterogeneous state, and it's not a disease. Lung transplantation is not a disease, despite what some of my general pulmonary colleagues try to convince me of. It is not actually a disease. There's many, many problems that can happen, but patients can do phenomenally well. And so I think the other challenge here is that there's so many topics that you're covering.
Yeah.
And we're a relatively young science. We're dealing with a science where the first successful lung transplant was done in 1983. And so the youth of the science, and I think the vast range and heterogeneity of the subject matter, makes it so that probably clinical subjects are going to float to the top, even more so than another disease, an actual disease.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a excellent point. I agree, and I think a lot of some of the questions were very specific to the problems that lung transplant recipients experience, but some of them were equally applicable to any other solid organ transplant. To be honest, like the questions about communication and education between patients and their team are not unique to lung transplant. They were just sort of proposed in the context of this health condition, but I think those are probably important to all transplant recipients.
And Michael had a question.
Yeah, first, thank you, Phil, for following the guidance for this seminar to wear black turtlenecks, because we were the only two who read the memo. So why I was recently listening to Tim Caulfield, and he gave an analysis and overview about the impact of social media and influences and the pseudoscience on patients and patients' families. So I'm wondering whether your survey is capturing that aspect about what's the source of truth here? Is it Phil's molecules, or my pathology was our discussion? But now we're dealing with many, many more alternative truths about lung transplantation and the chips you implant to these patients and what you not all do. So is that, I would like to hear the patient perspective, what that does to them in a very measurable or objective way. I think many of us had these conversations during the pandemic where friend groups and University or Facebook talked about what is right or wrong to do. Mm-hmm. And we all know what the impact was on us care providers in interacting effectively with patients. So, and it seems like this has not gone away now, even with the pandemic declared being over. There is still a trend, according to Tim Caulfield, of a significant impact of alternative sources of information informing patients in their decision making. So I'm wondering whether your survey is capturing that side, or is it only focused on the identified or credentialed healthcare provider community?
It's a great question, and it's in there. I mean, I read every single response to these surveys, and some of them we took out. Again, in full transparency, every response will be up on that website at some point. And so if you're really interested, you can go see, some of them were along those lines of really the questions were completely inspired and based in misinformation. There were questions about, COVID vaccine chips, and there were some about, other topics that I won't bring up that were really out of scope and really clearly inspired by some sort of misinformation. The most common topic was education, and I think what came out of looking at all of these questions is how much trust these people put in their care team and how much desire there is for more education at every stage of their journey, from the pre and post transplant. And even in a program where I think we do an excellent job of educating, and that's not the physicians, it's the coordinators and the physiotherapists and the dietitians, the people that spend a lot of time with these patients and teach them and are providing that information. They do an excellent job of that in our program, and I think patients still even want more. And so I think we need to adapt to the times to find better ways of getting that information to patients in an accessible way that's understandable to them. And because I know every program provides education, and yet the responses from the survey are telling us that they either feel that they're not getting the information, they're not retaining the information, or they're not happy with the way it's being delivered. And so that was pervasive throughout this experience, was how important that was to patients. And it came up a lot in the workshop too, but this specifically, the sort of media sources were not really in there. There wasn't a lot about social media versus traditional media versus healthcare providers, but I think there were a lot of questions about using, apps and sort of other ways of delivering non-pharmacological interventions like rehabilitation or education. And we found there already are trials out there using these to deliver non-pharmacologic interventions such as education. So I do think your question really highlights some of the future needs and some of the ways we might answer those questions about education, which is how can we use, innovative approaches, social media, to meet the needs that patients are telling us they have with respect to education.
Yeah, look, I heard this in several venues. Having a credible source of information is really important. Patients are in a vulnerable position, and there were patient advocates at this event where Tim spoke, a very vulnerable position, and misinformation is not really helpful. So I think it's up to us as a community to deliver that information in a way that it reaches our patients. That's the challenge to us, right? And make sure that there are checks and balances for the quality. And in the past, we focused on quality, not so much of how we disseminate it. So I think I applaud you to these innovative approaches. It's really great.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll make a final statement on that is that, you know, we are dealing with a group that is already pretty selected to be adherent, listen to healthcare clinicians, and take that information. So I think the problem is actually probably a lot bigger than what we appreciate, because there's a lot of patients out there who are, you know, never being considered because they don't adhere to, or they don't listen to medical advice, or they don't take it, or they don't have access to it, or they have other social, you know, barriers to receiving or using that care. So I think it's probably a bigger problem what you've outlined than is captured in our project, because of the selection bias of post, you know, engaging post-transplant patients.
Just a comment in the chat about credible sources like websites or apps. And then one other question in the chat here, and then I'll get to Dr. West as well. But Sean was just asking about the James Lind PSP for Dementia in Canada being actually very influential in leading to a national dementia framework that was adopted by Health Canada and PHAC in 2019. Are there opportunities for building similarly on the PSP towards raising the profile of donation and transplantation care and research in Canada?
That's a great question. I probably can't answer. I'd probably throw it back to the audience here. There are far more influential people here that could likely take that forward, or hopefully couple this with the work that's already been done by the ATI for research priorities, and maybe help use both of those approaches to inspire something like a national framework or strategy. I feel like I probably can't answer that.
Yeah, no, when you scan through the James Lind website, it's actually quite inspiring how many Canadian projects have been hosted there, and just the legs that they've had, which is, you know, just inspiring. Lori.
Dr. West.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Yeah, that was such an interesting seminar. Thank you so much. And it was great to see the history of scurvy again and things like that, how this has an impact going way back. I guess I was just wondering about psychosocial issues and you know, in many, as Samantha has pointed out, in many consensus conferences, psychosocial issues are raised as patient, you know, especially by patient-related groups. Did you have any thoughts on that?
There was a lot, and once we had this published in our top 25, there were a lot of psychosocial and education related topics, and you know, ultimately the top 10 did really focus on more of the biomedical problems, but they are well represented in our top 25 list that we actually shortlisted. So there's a variety of things that came up in the process about even finances and sort of, you know, there was a seminar a couple of months ago about the hub and spoke model that we use here in Alberta, and about some of the financial pressures that still puts on patients. And so, you know, those are more a social level problems, I think, and healthcare system level problems that made their way into our project, but didn't necessarily make it in the top 10. But again, just to emphasize that doesn't mean they're unimportant. They're very important. And I think there are projects there that people could take forward and cite this, saying, hey, this is actually a problem that's among the top 25 problems for recipients. Let's focus our efforts on this.
Dr. Halloran?
Yeah, just listening to your comments and the other questions, it occurred to me that you have an opportunity here, which is to intervene on one of the major problems affecting outcomes, which is non-adherence. Almost all T-cell mediated rejection that we see is probably related to a lapse in immunosuppression, or by the clinician or the patient. And T-cell mediated rejection is a very serious disease for lungs or livers or hearts or kidneys. And it predisposes to CLAD, and it's preventable. And so you have an opportunity to engage these patients and perhaps change their approach to their behaviors. Humans don't like taking drugs, and saying, here's a bunch of drugs, take them for the rest of your life. That's not very effective. And you have an opportunity perhaps to start to engage in a new conversation about this. We treat T-cell mediated rejection with steroids. We suppress it. It doesn't change the outcomes. It's a very, very bad disease, and it's preventable. And now you have an opportunity for a new forum for conversations about problems like this. And you can identify the patients who are at risk, the young man with a pickup truck, for example. So think about that. Are you in your hands now? Is there an opportunity for another level of intervention or communication?
I think the short answer is yes, and that is, there are a couple of adherence related questions that came up that didn't make it in the top 10. But when we were going through this evidence check, it's remarkable. There actually are multiple randomized trials looking at different interventions, behavioral interventions for adherence in transplant populations, and some of them are successful, but ultimately the success rates, when you look at the actual outcome rates, the adherence metric, it's actually not that great. Even in the intervention or arms. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. And that's probably low hanging fruit, I think but adherence is such a complicated topic into itself, right? It's often not entirely driven by, patient choice. It's driven by all of the other things that inspired some of our questions, like side effects and complications. And so that there are a lot of levels there, I think, and I do think it was reflected, throughout our process. I probably should have sent out the top 25, because you could see that some of those questions did come up, and were important.